produced by Frank Lopez and Don Paley with the Vancouver Media Co-op. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm joined here in Toronto by Art Manuel. He is the former chief of the Neskonlith Band in British Columbia and spokesperson for the Indigenous Network on Economies and Trade. Why are Indigenous people coming out into the streets here in Toronto, Art?
Because basically Indigenous people are the first ones that are impacted by the major sort of resource extraction type industries that these big conferences actually, engender in their strategies, and so we have to we are part of the whole process, in the sense that we're the people that are hurt at the community level in terms of hunting and fishing and food gathering that we depend on. It doesn't matter if it's in North America, but it can be anywhere in Central South America and Asia, all around the world. There's like 370 million Indigenous people globally, the United Nations passed a declaration called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. 141 nations voted in favor, 4 voted against it, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And those are very key players in the G8, G20 equation, and those are the people that Indigenous people come to the streets to let the government know that you need to deal with Indigenous issues too in your global plans, because it's Indigenous people that actually are the ones that fight against a lot of these big dams, the tar sands, all these big issues that are happening out there is Indigenous people. In Canada, we've been to court constantly, the Supreme Court fighting against these big developments, more so than even some of the environmental groups, because our people really depend on the ecological biodiversity that is damaged by these kind of things. And we don't want the G8 and the G20 to circumvent the rights that we've gotten recognized, like in the UN, and through the the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Art Manuel, talk about your case against the WTO. When did it happen? What happened?
Well, in our case, there was a dispute between Canada and the United States on Canada softwood lumber dispute, they called it. Canada exports about $10 billion worth of 2x4s to the United States. And the small mill owners in the United States felt that Canada wasn't charging fair market stuffage on timber being exported, so they initiated an action which resulted in the U.S. Department of Commerce imposing a 27% countervailing duty on Canada 2x4s, and Canada brought it to the World Trade Organization. And so we interceded with an amicus curiae submission. And our submission basically said under WTO subsidy law that the Canadian policy of not recognizing judicially recognized, constitutionally protected Aboriginal treaty rights is a cash subsidy to the Canadian forest industry, and the World Trade Organization accepted it, And so basically it's saying that Indigenous people are subsidizing the Canadian economy through our rights not being recognized. And we also had the same thing happen with regard to the North American Free Trade Agreement when Canada went there. We put in a submission, and Canada actually hired lawyers in Washington, D.C. to argue against us, and we won. The submissions were accepted, which basically means Canada, as a country, has Aboriginal treaty rights that have been recognized by the courts, protected by the Constitution, but they will not recognize it politically, and which makes Indigenous people poor, because our rights as Indigenous people are not recognized in decision making with regard to access and benefit sharing with regard to our natural resources in this country, which means that that's what's being talked about here at G8, G20 is actually the land and the resources of Indigenous people, but we're totally left out of the picture at this level.
Given this is a global summit, G8 and G20, are you having global meetings with other Indigenous leaders and activists from around the world, and have they come here?
We do have meetings constantly, in terms of Indigenous peoples caucuses and forums at the global level. We do have annually, the United Nations has the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York City, and the Indigenous people do get together in the form of a global Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and we do talk about these kinds of issues. The next big session that we will be having is in Nagoya in October, when the Convention on Biological Diversity will be happening. We will be having our global caucus there again. So we do